maybe we can begin as a way of introduction as well. You can tell us a little about when you first became aware of this concept of the missing years of Jesus and why you decided to investigate them.
Well, as far back as I can remember, perhaps in the 1970s when I was at school, I was aware that there were these missing years of Jesus, that the biblical accounts wrote about him up until the age of 12, and then there was a gap of 18 years, and then they start speaking about him at the age of 30. And I suppose the thing that kept it in my mind, and the thing that keeps it in the minds of a great many people in Britain, is that we have an alternative national anthem, and it's called Jerusalem, and the words were written by the great poet, painter and mystic William Blake. And this song is sung on every conceivable occasion in Britain. It's far more popular than our own national anthem. It's sung at sporting events, rugby, football, it's sung at cricket, it's sung at weddings, it's sung at funerals. It's just the most popular patriotic song in Britain, and it's just a wonderful combination of words and music. And the first verse of it, I won't sing it for you because you can find plenty of versions online, but the first verse simply reads, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen, and did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills, and was Jerusalem builded here amongst those dark satanic mills." So the way that Blake phrased this, it's obvious that it refers to no one else apart from Jesus, and he suggests that in ancient times that Jesus visited the British Isles.
So the question that arises obviously is who was William Blake and what did he know? Where did his information come from?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that, because this is a great bone of contention in Britain. He's a hugely popular person. He wrote all manner of poetry. He was a brilliant watercolor painter. And just as one, for example, one of the paintings that he did called The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun, featured in Thomas Harris's novel, Red Dragon, that's been turned into a film twice. But anyway, Blake was a great mystic, but the point about the words that he wrote is that they gave the best expression to the legends that had existed in the west of England, that Jesus actually visited this part of the country. So, to go back to your earlier question, I'd always been aware of this, but it was in about 2005, when I was studying Stonehenge, that it came to mind, because a number of people think that in the last line, when Blake refers to dark satanic mills, they thought that he was referring to Stonehenge, which I have to say is something I agree with. But it was that occasion that really brought to mind again the whole subject of the missing years of Jesus. So I started to look into it, and my first reaction was to look around for the best material that had been written on the subject, specifically of an investigation of Jesus visiting the west of England. But I couldn't find any. It just didn't exist. A number of books have been published over the years, and without wishing to, excuse me, denigrate them, they are all pretty much collections of these legends, and they follow on with the argument that there's no good reason that Jesus couldn't have come to Britain. But I thought, I presumed that there had to be more than that, more to it than that. So that's when I started to look into it.
And there's a number of things, of course, that exist outside of the Bible, and I definitely want to get into what the actual Bible says about this as well. But in regards to other external sources, there is a theory, I guess, that Jeremiah went to UK, I think. There is other things in regards to the Stone of Destiny and so forth that ended up in the UK as well. What about these theories? Tell us about that.
Well, when I started looking into it, this is jumping the gun slightly, but I realized that there's a huge amount to this. There are stories about the Britons being the lost tribe of Israel. There's the stories of the Stone of Destiny as well. But I had to really discipline myself and stick squarely to the subject of Jesus himself. I mean, another very prominent figure that's inextricably linked to this investigation is Joseph of Arimathea. And he was the mysterious character that features in all four Gospels. And he is the person who went to Pilate, asked for the body of Jesus, was given permission to take it down from the cross, and then he buried him, and then he vanished. So Joseph of Arimathea is one of the main figures, but with regard to the others that you mentioned, I had to really discipline myself to, I suppose, do the impossible, look for evidence of a young man from the Eastern Mediterranean in Britain 2,000 years ago. So that's what my book's about, and I stuck squarely to that.
And so, what did you find, and where did you go to begin to look for some of this information?
Well, when it occurred to me that no one else had ever conducted a proper investigation into his whereabouts, I didn't know where to look. I looked for about 6 months without knowing what on earth I was looking for or where I was looking or anything like that. And I pretty much gave up. I thought there's just nothing to find. All I could find were the legends, but I'll come back to those in a little while if that's okay, because there are some very specific aspects of them that are interesting. So what I did then was I started making some inquiries, because there are plenty of people in Britain who are very interested in Joseph of Arimathea. He's inextricably linked with Glastonbury in the west of England. But all the inquiries I made, I got a fairly, how can I put it, fairly haughty reply saying, well, of course, these are all medieval legends. And it just, I thought to myself, you know, why on earth should people in a small region of the west of England suddenly start inventing these stories? You know, that not just anyone came there, but that the most famous person who has ever lived came here. And I thought it was a remarkable thing that these supposed medieval people should just invent this out of thin air. And the other thing that struck me about the legends, they're all very interesting because none of them refer to miracles. I would have thought that if you were going to invent stories of a person such as Jesus in the west of England, that the legends would be full of stories of conversions and miracles and such like. But none of them have that. They were all really very straightforward stories of a young man coming aboard from a ship with his uncle, looking for water, working in mines in Cornwall, living in Somerset, building a church to his mother. They all seemed credible to me because none of them had any elements of magic, religion, even miracles or anything like that. So then the first thing I did was to look at the original Greek version of the Gospels, and I looked at the references to this Joseph of Arimathea, who is the most important, arguably the most important figure of the whole lot. I studied Greek when I was at school, but this was a long time ago. But I looked at the original Greek with very sophisticated translations telling me what I was looking at. And there are 411 words in total in the New Testament written on Joseph of Arimathea. And I sat and stared at those 411 words, Henrik, for something like 3 months. I thought, you know, there must be something here. I can't find something that's not there. And I had no intention of twisting anything at all to suit any agenda. But I thought there must be something there. So I read these words on and off for about 3 months, thinking I must be missing something. And it's possibly the thing that I'm most proud of, because this is in the original Greek. It's in the authorized version of the Testaments. There's no question of these being, doubtful or later Gospels. And the important part is that 3 of these Gospels speak of Joseph of Arimathea taking the body of Jesus down from a cross and then putting it in a tomb. But consulted in my book, but one of them specifically says that he dug the tomb himself. And the Greek word is elatomesen, and it's there, it's in black and white, anyone can check it at all. And it specifically says Joseph dug it himself. Now, to briefly go through it, this tomb that Jesus was said to have laid in, if you look at the gospel accounts, it was big enough to lay the figure of a grown man out in dignity. It was big enough to allow a large group of women inside carrying spices and bandages and such like. And it was also big enough for two figures who were variously described as angels or disciples to sit there. And when the visitors went in, one of the angels invited the people that were coming along to have a good look around to check that the body wasn't there the next morning. Now, I don't know how big a structure they were describing, but if that amount of people can go in, and if one of them can be invited to look around to check that the body isn't there, then it stands to reason that you're not looking at something the size of a broom cupboard. It's a decent-sized tomb. And it specifically says in the original Greek of the Bible that Joseph of Arimathea dug this thing himself. Now, the important part about that is that all the legends of Joseph of Arimathea in the West Country specifically link him to mining. They all say that he was involved in the tin trade and that he was a miner. And it's there in the Bible. It's been staring everyone in the face for 2,000 years. It's not a matter of interpretation or codes or anything like that. It's a single word that says he dug it himself. So when I found that, it was proof positive to me that these stories were medieval inventions, because it's there in the original source material, in all the versions, in unmistakable black and white. And it's there for everyone to see. It's so easy when you look at it yourself, in a translation or in the original. But it took me 3 months of staring at it before it jumped out of the page.
The Greek versions that you're talking about, is that the Septuagint?
It's the it's just the original Greek that the Gospels were recorded in. They're online. I can't remember where they are now, but I'll send you a link later that people can check it for themselves.
Interesting. And do you know if there's any translation differences if you look between the Greek and the original Aramaic?
The point is, I mean, there are always going to be different shades of translations. People always do things in different subtle ways. But this word, I checked it time and again. I went to see some very clever people at my local university, and I didn't tell them what I was asking them about. I just asked them to translate it, and it's pretty simple and straightforward stuff. New Testament Greek. I'm not an expert myself, but it's not regarded as the most difficult going. And it's as simple as that. I just asked these very clever men and women, what does this mean? And they just rattled it off. Oh, it means Joseph of Arimathea dug it himself. The word elatomesen, it comes, the temno part means cut, and the other part means stone. It's in all the classical dictionaries. There's no question about it. There's no doubt about it whatsoever.
Does it say anywhere in regards to where Joseph built the tomb, in what area, or does it talk about the?
It just says that he took the body to a tomb. I mean, where this tomb might have been, I don't know. Far cleverer people than myself have looked into the matter of where it is.
Yeah.
But what interested me was that it's there in the Bible that this man, that all the legends in Britain describe as being a miner and working in mines and quarries. It's there in the Bible. It's just, there can be no conceivable argument about it.
And so, of course, what supports that then is obviously that the legend is that Joseph of Arimathea went to the British Isles, and consequently it must have been in this area that he built the tomb then. Is that correct?
Oh no, the tomb was in the Holy Land. The tomb was in Palestine. This was after the crucifixion, you see.
Okay, yeah.
That's the part that the Bible is referring to.
Yeah.
but the legends in Britain all say that Joseph...
You were just, as we were cut off, you're just mentioning again, or basically reiterating the idea that all legends say that Jesus walked on those lands, so to speak. Maybe you can take it from there.
Yeah, well, the legends are very interesting and very specific. They don't contain any accounts of miracles. They all say that Jesus came aboard, came on to land in England to look for water, to work in mines, and they specify exactly where he did those. And I should just mention, in my book, I've got someone to compile it. No one had ever done this before, but I've got a map in my book that pinpoints every single location in the west of England where Jesus is said to have come. It's one thing to talk about the places, but when you look at the map yourself, they just make a very clear kind of sense. I mean, if your listeners aren't familiar with the west of England, that's fine, but there are a huge grouping at the far west of the country, which is where someone would have arrived by boats from the Mediterranean, and then there are a great big grouping of them further up in the areas where he is said to have worked in the mines.
I see, and of course for those who know about the Phoenicians and the Canaanites and so forth, will be aware that they did indeed went to the British Isles to do, just as you said, tin mining pretty much, and there was communications, so to speak, between these areas. And is that also something that you go into in your book?
Oh, yes, very much so. I've gone into that at great length about the Phoenicians. But, one of the strange things about this, Henrik, is that when you choose to look into these matters, they're all easily available, the classical accounts and such like. You can read them in libraries or you can read them online. But I found it quite shocking talking to a number of people since my book's been published who don't have the faintest idea that there was any communication between the Mediterranean and Britain in ancient times. I mean, Jesus is said to have come to Britain in 12 AD, and we know for an absolute fact that 60 years beforehand, Julius Caesar, the Roman emperor, twice tried to invade Britain. So everyone knew about Britain at the time, and the earliest account that we have of the Phoenicians sailing to Britain is between 500 and 700 BC, and it's almost certain that they came here before then anyway. So there's no doubt whatsoever people knew all about Britain. They were talking about a place called Albion as early as 525 BC, and of course that was 500 years before Jesus was born. So there's no problem whatsoever with the idea of people from his specific part of the world traveling to Britain repeatedly for a specific reason, which in this case was tin. A number of authorities think that the tin from the west of Cornwall went to make the bronze in the treasures of the Temple of Solomon, and Solomon's temple existed around about 1000 BC. And in the Bible, it famously describes how a craftsman called Hiram of Tyre made wonderful bronze treasures. And you make bronze by mixing tin with copper. So the ancient world had plenty of copper, but there wasn't so much tin around. And one of the best sources of tin is the west of England. So
yes.
None of these things are secrets. None of these things have to be dug out. They're all squarely in the public domain. It just depends if you look for them.
What about the name connection as well? Because if we look at the name Britannia, or might be derived from, there's different versions here basically, but the country of tin in Phoenician or Canaanite is Barat Anak or Barata, which is very similar to Britannia or the British Isles pretty much.
That's right. I mean, the generally accepted idea about the name Britannia is that it came from a Greek word, Prytanoi, meaning the painted people or the tattooed people. But certainly that business about the Phoenician name for the island of tin, that's at least possible as well. But whether it's true or not, we know for a fact that people from that part of the world, regularly came here.
So what about if we talk a little bit about the reasons for Jesus to go to Britain? Was he hunted in any way? Did he want to get out, or was it simply that he went to these the trading and working routes together with the other people from the area down in the Cana, or what do you think?
Well, when you look at it, Henrik, and I've spelt it out in my book, it's one of those things that if you start to look at it, it all, to my mind, becomes so obvious and straightforward. And I'll tell you one thing that I did when I started looking for this young man. One thing that I did was treat it as a missing persons case, the same way that the police look for missing people. But the advantage in Jesus' case is that he went missing for 18 years, which incidentally was over half his lifetime. But then he reappeared, and we know all about his famous reappearance because those were the years of his ministry.
Yes.
So you've got the bonus of looking for clues for a missing person, but also the person reappears, so you can examine his life then to see if there's anything of relevance. And there are four main aspects to it as I see it. There are reasons why he would have wanted to have left his homeland at the age of 12, reasons why he would have wanted to go to Britain rather than anywhere else, any evidence there might be in Britain of his stay, and fourthly, was there anything in his life when he reappeared and conducted his ministry that suggested he might have been in Britain. And I suppose one thing that immediately struck me is I've heard these stories of Jesus in India and Tibet and such like. And as a personal opinion, it sounds a great idea, but I think it's because in modern times we view these countries as havens of spirituality and knowledge. It seems a wonderful idea, him going there, and I would agree it seems a great idea. But one thing, and this is to do with the way I went about my investigation, I was particularly struck by the episode of the calming of the storm, which I presume you're aware of.
No, I'm not actually. Tell us about it.
Okay, it was an episode in the Bible during Jesus' later life when he was on board a ship, a fishing ship, on the Sea of Galilee, and a storm blew up. And the storm was so fierce that the men on board thought they were going to die. They thought they were going to drown. And so they went to find Jesus, and he was asleep. And not only was he asleep, but he had to be woken up. So that's one part of it. And when he woke up, it is said that he rebuked the storm, and the storm disappeared, and the waves were calm again. So that's a miracle that took place, if you believe in these things, that he rebuked the storm. But before that, you have a young man who's been missing for 18 years. He's on a ship on the Sea of Galilee. The men who were on the ship presumably have spent their entire working lives there. So if a storm blew up that was so fierce that these men thought they were going to die, then it must have been a terrible tempest. But Jesus was able not only to sleep through it, but they had to wake him up. So I asked myself, how is it that someone could do that? And if you believe the stories, that he sailed all the way through the Mediterranean, out through the Straits of Gibraltar, into the North Atlantic and up to Britain, and then presumably he had to sail all the way back. And I would guess that at some point during those 18 years he took to sea as well. Then a voyage of that size would be nothing to him when it came to the storm on the Sea of Galilee.
Right.
It just seems to me that is part of the proof that he was a seasoned mariner. When he reappeared from his missing years, he was able to sleep through storms at sea that made other people think they were going to die. So if he had been to Britain, then that is naturally how he would have acquired this ability. And I don't think that's an ability that someone who had spent 18 years in the mountains of Tibet would have acquired.
See what you mean. And, there's a lot of other research that points to the fact that the Celtic or Druidic people also was great teachers, so to speak. So what about the idea that he actually came to Britain to get knowledge or to meet a teacher there?
Well, I think that the two matters are separate of acquiring knowledge and meeting teachers, because you must remember that when Jesus was born, one of the stories says that a star appeared from the east and that three wise men followed the star, and that they prophesied that he would be the king of the Jews, or a Messiah. In other words, someone who would physically, by force of arms, drive the Romans out of his homeland. And we know that the Romans were hated because they'd taken over Judea. But again, it would have been common knowledge at the time that 60 years beforehand, the greatest general that Rome had ever known, Julius Caesar, had twice invaded Britain. Now, Julius Caesar's version was that he didn't invade Britain in its entirety because he couldn't be bothered and because halfway through there was some trouble in Gaul. But I don't think that's how the rest of the world would have seen it. I think they would have seen it that the Britons drove him out.
Yeah.
So if you were a young man at the age of 12 and you heard about this wonderful island at the edge of the known world where the priests didn't worship idols, because the Druids famously didn't worship idols, and where your uncle regularly went to get tin, and where people for 1,000 years from your homeland had travelled to acquire tin to make bronze for the Temple of Solomon, there would have been an awful lot of appealing things about Britain. And then when you heard that not only did these priests worship a heavenly father, which the Druids did, they claimed descent from a single heavenly father, not only did they not worship idols, the country provided tin, but also, twice before, 60 years before, these men had beaten the Roman legions.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Those are just some of the reasons. And if you put yourself in this young man's position, I say that this island at the end of the world would have had a huge appeal.
Absolutely. And, you know, in that regard, could it be also that Julius Caesar invaded Britain to go after this man? I don't know if this has been something that comes up in your research, but if we talk about some of the work of Ralph Ellis, for instance, he puts forth this theory that Jesus actually was of a royal line, came from a powerful merchant family attributed to the Bethany area, or if that was a family name, you know. And so the question then is if Julius Caesar went after him because he was actually a rival to the throne, because he was the king, so to speak, here that could take over the area.
Well, Caesar was around 60 years before Jesus, you see, so you know, that would have been an impossibility. That couldn't have happened. But of course, Britain was invaded later in 43 AD by the Emperor Claudius. But I've heard of these ideas, but again, just for anyone that might be interested, what I've done in my book is just stick to the facts of trying to find a missing person, regardless of whether he was of a royal line or whether he was a merchant or not. That's what my book's, you know, for better or worse, you know, that's what it's about, you see.
Yes.
So, you know, to answer your question again, the point is that 60 years beforehand, the Romans had been driven out of Britain, so that would have had a huge appeal for a young man who had been prophesied as a Messiah whose country was under Roman domination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you think it changes anything in regards to the myth, or add to the validity of the story of Jesus in any way?
Well, I have to say that by the time I'd finished researching and writing my book, my opinion of this young man had gone through the roof, because everything I'd heard about him before that, you just see him as an icon. You see him in paintings. You don't see the real person. And I did my level best to read about a young man, to investigate the life of a young man. And on a personal note, you know, my admiration for him, it went through the roof. But I get a very mixed response to my book. I get a lot of communications, mail and such like, where people very, very happy with it because no one before has put together quite so much information. But I also know that a lot of people, mainly devout Christians, won't, although not all of them by any means, but a lot of them won't so much as pick up my book because they're frightened of what it contains. And I suppose the main objection that people have is the idea that he could have spent as many as 18 years quite happily living alongside pagans. But to my mind, that's a ridiculous notion because we know that in his homeland he was famous for mingling with everyone, with all the unpopular sections of society, with lepers and the poor. He quite happily spoke to even Roman centurions and such like. So I personally don't see a problem. Wherever he was, he had to be somewhere. And if you're going to take the view that wherever he was, that it was a pagan place, then, you know, he hadn't started his ministry. His ministry only started at the age of 30. So wherever on earth he was, he would have been mingling with people that some people would have disapproved of.
I see. And what's your outlook or perspective on the question if Jesus is the Son of God, or was he just a man? Maybe he had some extraordinary knowledge or application in terms of spiritual knowledge and so forth, but has that changed in any regard, or where do you come from in regards to this question?
Well, I don't really have any views about whether he was the Son of God or not, but that brings up another aspect of his visit to Britain, because as part of my studies, I was fascinated to discover, and again, this is all in the public domain that anyone can find for themselves by looking on the internet or in museums, but the people of the time in Britain, they revered a war god of their own, and the name of this war god was Esus, E-S-U-S, and this man was also depicted as a carpenter as well, or as a woodsman, a man who felled trees with axes. Now, I'm not convinced that Jesus was a carpenter, but, you know, he may have been. His father Joseph is twice described as a tekton, which could mean a carpenter, but it is more likely to mean a general builder. But in any event, it seems clear to me that the people of the time were expecting the arrival of a young man who was a war god who would drive the Romans out, and that this young man was fit and healthy, and he is depicted with an axe, chopping down trees as a woodsman. So that is just another factor that lends credibility to the idea that he visited the west of England. It doesn't mean to say that this Celtic war god Esus was Jesus, but it does mean that the people of the time were actively looking out for someone of his kind. So it's not difficult to envisage what may have happened when Jesus turned up in the west of England. You know, I mean, it's putting it in very simple terms, but if he was asked, "What's your name?" and he said something along the lines of Jesus, then the people talking to him would have thought, well, that's interesting because we revere someone called Esus. And if they asked him what he did, and he said, well, you know, my dad's a carpenter, that's my trade, they would have thought, well, that's very interesting because our Esus is a woodsman or a carpenter. And if they had heard the other stories about his birth, of the star turning up and the wise men or the Magi, believing that he would be someone who would physically drive the Romans out, then it's not difficult to see that the people in Britain would have been absolutely amazed by this young man turning up, and would have held him in awe, you know, would have revered him, because I think that they may have seen him as the incarnation of the God that they were expecting.
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, that's also a number of theories that float around out there that basically Jesus did not exist at all, that he actually is a composite character of previous deities, and in some cases this might have been applied to a man that was living during that time for different reasons, of course, different reasons. I don't know if that's anything you discuss in your book or not, but the name similarities here are very interesting, aren't they?
Well, they are. There's even more than that, and this is the point where I really had some doubts about. I'm not sure whether it's right to question the integrity of historians and such like, but something else that I discovered is that Jesus is located at a very specific part of the west of England at a very specific time. In other words, between 12 AD and 30 AD. And in the exact place where he was supposed to have lived, it was the tribal territory of a British tribe called the Dobunni. It's a strange name, but it's one that I've been looking into with experts in linguistics and such like. But there exist coins. I mean, your listeners can look this up on the internet. They're very simple to find. These coins have the name Isu on them, and the name is spelled E-I-S-U, which again is similar to Asus and Jesus. I mean, we can't be certain, what name Jesus would have used if he came to Britain. I'm certain that he spoke Greek in any event. I mean, I've gone into this in great detail in my book because Greek was the common language in Palestine at the time. Not, people did speak Aramaic, but it was the common language that everyone got by in a very similar way to how English is used today. But in these on these coins, it has the name Isu on them, E-I-S-U, and we don't know who this man was, but we know that these coins were minted between 12 and 30 AD. So there are physical artifacts in the west of England which have existed for centuries, which people have known about, and it has this name on them. But no one, no prehistorian, no archaeologist, no expert on coins has ever said, isn't that an amazing coincidence? We have these very precise stories of Jesus coming here, and if he came to Britain, it must have been between 12 and 30 AD. And at the same time, we've always known about these coins, which were from exactly the same area at exactly the same time. Now, I can't prove that the name on these coins does refer to Jesus, but when I can't find a single reference going back over decades to anyone even saying, well, isn't that an amazing coincidence, then it makes me very suspicious.
Absolutely, and just as you said, to emphasize that point, I think it's absolutely legitimate to question all historians. If there's new information that challenge the consensus in some way, that's a good thing, and it needs to be looked into. So I think you're absolutely right there.
Well, there are other artifacts as well. I mean, I think that more might come to light, but I looked into this to the best I could, but I didn't get very far with it at all. But again, something your listeners can look up are things called tunic crosses, and they're stone crosses that exist in Cornwall, and they're very, very strange things because a crucifix or a cross, by definition, has to bear the body of Jesus on it. There's no one else that's likely to be on it. And these crosses in the west of England, they're called tunic crosses because they show, instead of a grown man being spread eagle and crucified, they show what appears to be a young man holding his arms wide, preaching. And these things exist. You can find, perfectly good quality photographs on the internet if you look for them. There are, I don't know how many there are. I don't think anyone has counted them, but there are perhaps 20 or 30 of them in Cornwall. So again, it seems a fantastic coincidence that one of the places that Jesus is said to have visited as a young man should have physical artifacts of stone, which are crosses, which instead of showing a crucified adult male, show a young man apparently wearing a tunic and holding his arms high. But again, no one has commented on it, and when people don't bother commenting, then I say, why not? What is the harm in commenting?
Yeah.
So,
absolutely. And a tunic, by the way, how do you spell that? Tunic?
Tunic.
Unic. Okay.
It just means like a sleeveless coat. It's the kind of thing that knights used to wear. put over their armor and put a belt around it. A
I see.
long sleeveless vest or coat, a tunic. But that's what I have in my book, is the possible existence of physical artifacts. And these aren't hidden away in the Vatican archive. These aren't buried in the British Museum, and you've got to take my word for it. They're on the internet on perfectly reputable sites. The coins bearing the name Izu, the tunic crosses in Cornwall, and of course there are the representation from the Pillar of the Sailors in Paris.
What is that? Tell us about that.
The Pillar of the Sailors, it was a stone found in the early 18th century in Paris in the foundations of Notre Dame Cathedral. And I'm having to rely on my memory here, but it had been built by sailors, because the inscription makes it quite clear. It had been built by sailors during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. And Tiberius's reign roughly coincides with the life of Jesus. They overlap to a great extent. And this is one of the representations of this war god that presumably was pronounced Isus, a young man wielding an axe, cutting down a tree with the inscription Isus above it. And so we know that was made because the inscription tells us during the reign of Tiberius, which coincides with Jesus. But I could go on for hours, Henrik. There's more and more material there when you look for it. I mean, in the north of France, just across the channel from where Jesus is supposed to have lived for 18 years, the Romans recorded, it wasn't a tribe, they think it was a confederation of tribes called the Esuvii, which means the men of Isus, or the men of Jesus. It was presumably some kind of cult. Some people were expecting the arrival of a young man who was a carpenter, who would be a Messiah, who would physically drive the Romans out, which again is a remarkable correlation with what we know of Jesus.
So do you think that's a mythology, a story, or a prophecy, or did this spring up after the fact he might have been there or visited the area? What do you think?
Well, all these statues and such like of this war god, they predate the time of Jesus. So it just seems simple to me what we know of this man, and we know that the aversion that the Britons and the Celts had to the Romans, they hated each other. So it just seems to me to be beyond coincidence that the Celts should have revered a war god with such an unusual name, with the profession of the carpenter, when all the stories place exactly such a man in the west of England. It just seems to me that if he had turned up there, which I'm certain that he did, then he would have been welcomed with open arms.
What do you think about the return of Jesus to the Middle Eastern regions, or Galilee, or where exactly he came back to? What do you know about that, or why did he return? Well,
presumably because whatever ideas he might once have had about physically driving the Romans into the sea, we know that he changed his mind at some point, and that he embarked upon his ministry with the preachings that presumably all of us are familiar with. And what really interests me again is that if you start to look into his physical characteristics when he returns, ones that are in the Bible, every single one of them he could have acquired anywhere on earth, I suppose, but when you put them all together, it shows to me beyond doubt that he'd spent his time in Britain. I mean, one of them, for example, is his state of preparedness, because when he appears, he doesn't get anything wrong. He's given his ministry a great deal of thought. He's never caught out. No one ever puts a question to him, and he never says, "Oh, I better go away and think about that." He's thought about it for a long, long time. He knows exactly what he wants to do. So that suggests to me that he had prepared very carefully for it in a sympathetic environment, without interruptions or without fear, without being worried about the Romans killing him. and without worry about his own kind killing him, as we both know happened later. So
Yes.
that would fit in with it.
Mm.
We also know from numerous classical accounts that, we know that the Druids used Greek letters. Julius Caesar recorded that. Again, this isn't some obscure writing. It's in Caesar's accounts of the civil wars the wars in Britain, and he recorded that the Druids used Greek letters. So we know, it's almost certain that Jesus spoke in Greek, because there are a couple of points in the Bible where he lapses into Aramaic, when he says, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" So you wonder, if they put that in Aramaic, why bother? Presumably he was speaking in Greek for the rest of the time. But anyway, the point is that there was a long-standing connection between the Greeks and Britain, and we know that the Druids used Greek letters and presumably spoke Greek. Perhaps the most, for me, the most telling characteristic of the whole lot was that, and it's one that still causes enormous trouble these days, is Jesus' attitude towards women. It still divides the church. People still argue about it. But from my understanding, at the time of Jesus in Palestine, women were third-rate citizens. They were very poorly treated. But the way he associated with them caused an absolute sensation at the time. And still 2,000 years later, people argue about it. And we know, again from the classical accounts, that at the time that Jesus was said to have visited Britain, that women were revered in this country. Some years later, we had the famous Boadicea, Queen Boadicea. Her husband died. He left his money partly to Nero, the Roman emperor, and partly to his wife and 2 daughters. But he wasn't to know that Nero had changed the tax rules, which meant that any Roman citizen had to pay all their goods upon their death to the Roman emperor. So when Boadicea's husband died, her 2 young daughters were raped, and Boadicea was stripped naked and beaten with metal rods in public. And she raised one of the greatest revolts that Rome had ever known at the time. It was in about 60 AD. Easily 70,000 people were killed. And the point is that the Britons at the time were perfectly happy to follow a woman into battle. We know from these accounts that women, they had equal rights in this country. There was another one called Queen Cartimandua. So if Jesus caused a sensation upon his return by his attitude to women, by treating them as equals and such like, then it's simply another part that falls into place, because we know that had he spent some time in Britain, he would have been amazed at how women were treated here. So that again is another aspect to me of a characteristic that he returned home with that he had to acquire somewhere else, and I think it would have been Britain.
Interesting. And how? Maybe you can tell us a bit about just the connection between, you mentioned before, Joseph of Arimathea and Glastonbury. Are there myths in regards to this as well?
Yes, not only is there a myth, but as I understand it, Joseph of Arimathea brought his young nephew Jesus to Britain during these missing years, and then afterwards, again, we know this from medieval accounts, and it's in my book, there were 4 separate church councils in medieval times that specifically debated the question of which was the oldest church in the world. And they all said, these 4 independent councils, that the oldest church in the world was in Britain. It was older even than the Roman church. And they all agreed that the British church, or Christianity in Britain, had been started by Joseph of Arimathea, who came here, as they say, shortly after the crucifixion. And one of the myths is that, well, it's a myth, but it may be true, is that when Joseph returned here after the crucifixion, with several other people whose names are documented, they were returning to the Glastonbury area, and they were searching for a place to stay, and they were just all tired and exhausted. So Joseph thrust his staff into the ground and it miraculously flowered on a place called Wearyall Hill. And this thing is known as the Glastonbury thorn, and it survived up until the time, as I understand it, of the English Civil Wars, which were in 1640, when one of Cromwell's men cut it down. But it's still there now, or a descendant of the same tree is still there. And every year, and this again is not a big state secret, every year some branches of this Glastonbury tree, which supposedly came from Joseph of Arimathea, are presented to the Queen of England by children from Glastonbury.
Oh, really? Now that's very interesting.
Yes, you know, again, Henrik, I mean, my point is I can't emphasize it enough. With my book, I've stuck squarely to trying to find where this young man was. I'm not overly bothered or concerned with who he was, but I've just tried my best to see if there's information that suggests he was in Britain. And everything in my book is in the public domain. And this business of the Glastonbury thorn, every year it's presented to Queen Elizabeth by children from the town. It's a fact, but it's, I suppose, like anything else, unless someone tells you about it, you're not to know about it. But also, Queen Elizabeth left a cross at Glastonbury herself. I think from memory it was in the early 1960s.
65 I read here, yes, that's right.
That's it. And I'm struggling now because I'm trying to remember all these things, but there was a wonderful inscription on this cross saying that Glastonbury was a Christian shrine so old that its origins are lost in legend. So, you know, these things are recognized in Britain by the royal family, by the church, but they don't go quite as far as I do. But I know from the reception I've had from my book is that so many people are delighted that I've written it because I've put all this information together. And again, I can't stress enough, it's not, you don't have to take my word for anything. Every single thing in my book, anyone can find and check for themselves. But it's just that I put it together first, I suppose.
Well, that's something very interesting material in regards to everyone who's interested in the what's called the British Israelite connection, pretty much, and the fact that the royal family seem to have been picking up on that fact as well with this Glastonbury thorn and all that. So that's very interesting indeed. But Dennis, why don't we do like this? That we can take a little break here then between our 2 hours, and of course maybe you can round things up for us by telling us about people who are interested and want to read more and want to get a copy of your book. Where do we go to do that?
Okay. Well, if you look on my website, which you announced earlier, Eternal Idol, there's a great deal on there. There's a lot about Stonehenge, but there's a static page there at the top about the book, and you can find how to order it from there, from the publishers. But I've also set up another site, and it's, again, very simple. It's www.themissingyearsofjesus.com. So you can find information on how to order the book. And there's also a big page of reviews there that have been given to my book by archaeologists, Christians, scholars, Druids. So you make up your own mind. Look at it first and have a think about it. And there's more information on there. It ultimately leads back to my Eternal Idol site. But it's just a matter of time, you know, how much I've been able to put on there. But there's a separate site for the book, missingyearsofjesus.com cross, and then he buried him, and then he vanished. So Joseph of Arimathea is one of the main figures, but with regard to the others that you mentioned, I had to really discipline myself to, I suppose, do the impossible, look for evidence of a young man from the Eastern Mediterranean in Britain 2,000 years ago. So that's what my book's about, and I stuck squarely to that.
And so what did you find, and where did you go to begin to look for some of this information?
Well, when it occurred to me that no one else had ever conducted a proper investigation into his whereabouts, I didn't know where to look. I looked for about 6 months, without knowing what on earth I was looking for or where I was looking or anything like that. And I pretty much gave up. I thought there's just nothing to find. All I could find were the legends, but I'll come back to those in a little while if that's okay, because there are some very specific aspects of them that are interesting. So what I did then was I started making some inquiries, because there are plenty of people in Britain who are very interested in Joseph of Arimathea. He's inextricably linked with Glastonbury in the west of England. But all the inquiries I made, I got a fairly, how can I put it, fairly haughty reply saying, well, of course, these are all medieval legends. And it just, I thought to myself, why on earth should people in a small region of the west of England suddenly start for the best material that had been written on the subject, specifically of an investigation of Jesus visiting the west of England? But I couldn't find any. It just didn't exist. A number of books have been published over the years, and without wishing to, excuse me, denigrate them, they are all pretty much collections of these legends, and they follow on with the argument that there's no good reason that Jesus couldn't have come to Britain. But I thought, I presumed that there had to be more than that, more to it than that. So that's when I started to look into it.
And there's a number of things, of course, that exist outside of the Bible, and I definitely want to get into what the actual Bible says about this as well. But in regards to other external sources, there is a theory, I guess, that Jeremiah went to UK, I think. There is other things in regards to the Stone of Destiny and so forth that ended up in the UK as well. What about these theories? Tell us about that.
Well, when I started looking into it, this is jumping the gun slightly, but I realized that there's a huge amount to this. There are stories about the Britons being the lost tribe of Israel. There's the stories of the Stone of Destiny as well. But I had to really discipline myself and stick squarely to the subject of Jesus himself. I mean, another very prominent figure that's inextricably linked to this investigation is Joseph of Arimathea. And he was the mysterious character that features in all four Gospels. And he is the person who went to Pilate, asked for the body of Jesus, was given permission to take it down from inventing these stories. That not just anyone came there, but that the most famous person who has ever lived came here. And I thought it was a remarkable thing that these supposed medieval people should just invent this out of thin air. And the other thing that struck me about the legends, they're all very interesting because none of them refer to miracles. I would have thought that if you were going to invent stories of a person such as Jesus in the west of England, that the legends would be full of stories of conversions and miracles and such like. But none of them have that. They were all really very straightforward stories of a young man coming aboard from a ship with his uncle, looking for water, working in mines in Cornwall, living in Somerset, building a church to his mother. They all seemed credible to me because none of them had any elements of magic, religion, even miracles or anything like that. So then the first thing I did was to look at the original Greek version of the Gospels, and I looked at the references to this Joseph of Arimathea, who is the most important, arguably the most important figure of the whole lot. I studied Greek when I was at school, but this was a long time ago. But I looked at the original Greek with very sophisticated translations telling me what I was looking at. And there are 411 words in total in the New Testament written on Joseph of Arimathea. And I sat and stared at those 411 words, Henrik, for something like 3 months. I thought...
Maybe we can begin as a way of introduction as well. You can tell us a little about when you first became aware of this concept of the missing years of Jesus and why you decided to investigate them.
Well, as far back as I can remember, perhaps in the 1970s when I was at school, I was aware that there were these missing years of Jesus, that the biblical accounts wrote about him up until the age of 12, and then there was a gap of 18 years, and then they start speaking about him at the age of 30. And I suppose the thing that kept it in my mind, and the thing that keeps it in the minds of a great many people in Britain, is that we have an alternative national anthem, and it's called Jerusalem, and the words were written by the great poet, painter and mystic William Blake. And this song is sung on every conceivable occasion in Britain. It's far more popular than our own national anthem. It's sung at sporting events, rugby, football, it's sung at cricket, it's sung at weddings, it's sung at funerals. It's just the most popular patriotic song in Britain. And it's just a wonderful combination of words and music. And the first verse of it, I won't sing it for you because you can find plenty of versions online. But the first verse simply reads, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here amongst those dark satanic mills?" So the way that Blake phrased this, it's obvious that it refers to no one else apart from Jesus. And he suggests that in ancient times that Jesus visited the British Isles.
So the question that arises obviously is who was William Blake and what did he know? Where did his information come from?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that because this is a great bone of contention in Britain. He's a hugely popular person. He wrote all manner of poetry. He was a brilliant watercolor painter. And just as one, for example, one of the paintings that he did called The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun, featured in Thomas Harris's novel, Red Dragon, that's been turned into a film twice. But anyway, Blake was a great mystic, but the point about the words that he wrote is that they gave the best expression to the legends that had existed in the west of England, that Jesus actually visited this part of the country. So, to go back to your earlier question, I'd always been aware of this, but it was in about 2005, when I was studying Stonehenge, that it came to mind, because a number of people think that in the last line, when Blake refers to dark satanic mills, they thought that he was referring to Stonehenge, which I have to say is something I agree with. But it was that occasion that really brought to mind again the whole subject of the missing years of Jesus. So I started to look into it, and my first reaction was to look around